guys, today it's time for another ranking my last 10 palettes video. Of course, I have a bunch of palettes in front of me. These are my last 10 palettes and I'm terrified. I haven't even sat down and looked at these to figure out where to rank them because I'm so scared because the top 3 are going to be so hard. I already know it, there's so many good palettes in this bunch that I almost feel bad no matter where I rank some of these, but I think we should just go ahead and get into it. So basically what I do is I take all of the last 10 palettes that I've tried and I rank them from what I consider to be the worst or the least inspiring or whatever reason it is that it ends up on the bottom up to the top, and then I explain to you why they end up in the rankings that they did. So let's just go ahead and start on the bottom. This is so hard, you guys. I feel like this palette doesn't deserve to be so low down on the list, but on the other hand, when I compare it to all of these other palettes, I just don't really feel like it stacks up, you know? So it's not that this is a bad palette, but this is the new Milani palette. It's called the Beautiful Nightmare palette. I just feel like the mattes in this palette just aren't really up to par with what I'm used to using these days, and I get it, it's a drugstore palette and they don't usually, branch out and do colorful eyeshadows like this. Maybe that's why this is a little bit subpar to what I'm kind of comparing this to right now, but for me, this just didn't live up to my, I don't know, I didn't even really have high expectations going into it if I'm being honest, but I was hoping for a little bit more, and I just felt like the mattes wouldn't really stick to my eye very nicely. They didn't build that well. The black is quite nice, but the other mattes that I tried, I used this blue and I used this red, I just felt like they kind of faded off my eyes as soon as I put them on, and it took a lot of building up and blending out and building up and blending out to really get it to look the way that I wanted to, and it was just a little bit too much work for what I like to put into my eyeshadow looks. I really expect my eyeshadows to do some of the work for me, and if they don't do that, they're just not that great, you know? So let's move on. For the number 9 spot, some people are going to be upset with me right now because so many people love this brand, myself included, but this palette it's not really what I want in my eyeshadows, and it doesn't mean it's a bad palette by any means. This just isn't my preferences when it comes to color stories, and I did get this sent in PR. I don't think I would have bought this myself if I didn't, simply because of the color story. So this is the new Nomad palette. This is the Cartagena Magica palette. I don't know if I'm saying that right this time, but this is what the palette looks like, and to me, this is just way too restricting. I just don't feel like there's a lot of looks that you can do with this that aren't all going to end up being very similar, and it also just doesn't have a lot of depth. And for me, those are just the most important things for me when I look at an eyeshadow palette. I want variety. I want to be able to make a lot of looks. I want to be able to have depth in my looks, and I just don't feel like this palette really gives me everything that I look for in my palette. Like I said, it's not a bad palette. It's just not what I look for in my palette, so I just couldn't place this any higher, and I feel bad about it because I really love Nomad, but this just didn't cut it for me. Let's move on. For the number 8 spot, this is a palette that, honestly, a lot of these palettes I've only used once, but that's just kind of how it goes. I just don't have time to do more looks with all of the palettes that come into my collection. But this is the new Venus 2, it's not even new, but this is new to me. It's the Venus 2 Lime Crime palette. I used this in my video where I tried out a bunch of makeup I got from Look Fantastic, so they did send me this, and I had a really good time with this palette. I don't even really know why I'm kind of ranking this as low as I did, but looking at it, I'm not as inspired looking at this palette as I am with the other palettes, and also this shade right here is a matte with glitter in it, which I don't love that, even though I did get a really nice look out of it, but I don't see myself ever really reaching for this palette, outside of just the video that I did. I don't know. The shimmers just aren't all that either. They're kind of satiny, and even though the mattes are really nice, I don't know, it just doesn't really inspire me that much. I kind of just picked up this palette to use in the video because it had the colors that I was looking for the look for that video, if that makes sense. So it's not a bad palette, again, like I said, it's just, right now, it's just not what I want to be using. In the number 7 spot is a palette that I had a really good time playing with in my video. That video should be up already, but this is the new 50/50 Autumn palette. I really love this brand. I really like this palette. I like the color story a lot, but the only reason why this ended up so low is because I'm just more inspired by the other color stories, and I feel like, talking about quality now, the rest of the palettes are just as good quality as this one. So I don't know, it's just one of those days where I kind of have to see what I'm feeling on the day, and I feel like if I were to do this this ranking tomorrow or next week, maybe this palette would have ended up higher up on my list. It really just depends on the day, and today this palette this is the spot where it inspired me. So it just ended up being number 7. It's not a bad palette at all. I would definitely recommend it if you've been looking at it, but today it's just what I'm feeling. Spot number 6. This is a palette that I think this color story to me is just so much fun. Is it the best quality palette in the bunch? I wouldn't say it is, and the shimmer formula is also not my favorite. I also think that the packaging is a little bit cheap with the sticker here, but this is the Recent palette by GJ's Unique Boutique. If you haven't seen this palette, honestly, the color story is just doing it for me today, and this is why this palette ended up being as high as it is. Like I said, the quality of this palette is maybe not as good as the quality of some other palettes that I have in this bunch, but I still think it's fine. The shimmers are kind of lackluster for what I look for in my eyeshadows, but we all know how picky I am when it comes to shimmers, and these just didn't really hit the spot for me, but the mattes performed really well when I did use it. And like I said, I'm just so inspired by this color story, and it makes me want to use this palette more than it makes me want to use other palettes. So that's why this palette ended up being so high on my list. And honestly, color stories for me is just so important. Even if the formula maybe isn't perfect, I'm still going to be wanting to reach for a color story that inspires me more, even if the formula is maybe a little bit worse. And that is also why this next palette ended up being so high. This is the new Urban Myth palette from Black Moon Cosmetics. So this ended up in the number 5 spot, honestly, mostly because of the color story. I don't think this is a bad palette at all, and I did have a pretty good time when I used it in my first impression video, but I just felt like the mattes weren't anything to write home about. Like, they're fine, and the shimmers, they're also fine. I felt like these two shimmers were a little bit too flaky for what I like in my shimmers, and the other shimmers were a little bit sheer for what I like in my shimmers. So not the perfect formula for me, but I know a lot of people that I've seen videos from really ended up liking this palette. But this is just a preference thing, so just because this isn't like the perfect formulas for me and what I like doesn't mean it's a bad palette. But the color story is just so fantastic in this, and it still makes me want to use it, even though I know that using this I'm not going to have as good of a time using it like in the process itself than maybe I would with some of these other palettes. But it still makes me want to use this palette because the color story is just so good. Now for the top 4, this is so hard. I keep going back and forth and like switching around the order. Like, I know the number 1 spot, but for 2, 3, and 4, I'm having such a hard time. But I think I'm gonna have to rank this as number 4. This is the Ace Beauté Flare palette. And it hurts me to do this because this ended up winning my fall palette rankings. But just comparing this palette to the other palettes that I have left, I don't know. I don't feel like I can place this any higher, and I've only used this once, so that probably has something to do with it. All of these other palettes I've done more looks with, and I know what I can get out of them. Maybe that is what is making me rank them a little bit higher. I'm not really sure, but the way it is right now, this ended up being my number 4 spot, and I had a really good time playing with this. I didn't have any issues at all. I think it's a beautiful color story. It's a beautiful palette. I wish I had more time to use this. I wish that if I did a video with this, it would actually do good, but I know it won't because it's an old palette and it's just the way it is being a YouTuber. So yeah, I don't know. I wish I had a reason for why I ranked this the way I did, but I really don't. The only thing I do know is that I love all of these 3 palettes that I'm going to rank next. So next up, this is new for me because next up we have the Glamlight palette, and Glamlight did not win the ranking this time around, and I feel bad about it because this palette is so beautiful, and I feel like it's unfair to this palette to have to compete against these other 2 that are still left in my ranking because this palette is so beautiful. I had such a good time playing with this. I've done 4 looks with this. I didn't have any problems whatsoever with any of these colors. I think they all performed really well. The only thing that I feel like I'm missing is a little bit of depth in this palette, but other than that, it's a beautiful palette. I can't rank this any higher because of the 2 palettes that I have left. I just like a little bit more, which you probably won't be surprised when you see it. So next up, I feel like a lot of you are going to guess that this is going to be my number 1 spot, but this is actually going to be number 2. So this is the Worldy palette by P. Louise, and the reason I just could not rank this on top is number 1, the packaging is just so bulky and it's so heavy and it's so big, and it also has only 3 shimmers, which are all very dark. So Formula-wise, the mattes in this are spectacular. The color story is amazing. Everything about this palette I love, but I could not rank this as number one because of the palette that I have left. And this is the new Terra Moons palette. This is the El Barrio palette. I haven't had as much fun doing looks with any palette, I think, as I did when I did my 3 looks with this one. I just had such a good time. The shadows just perform so well. I love the shimmers. They just make me so happy. And they're so bright and they're so just rich, and I just love them. I don't know what else to say. I love the packaging of this. I love that it's a 9-pan. I do prefer smaller palettes, so that probably had something to do with the other 2 large ones being number 2 and 3, because to me a 9-pan palette is just more inspiring when it has a color story that really speaks to me. And these colors are just so me. So I don't know, I didn't feel like I had a choice. I had to rank this as number 1 because I just absolutely love this palette. And like I said, I had such a good time playing with this that there was no way that this wasn't going to win. So I don't know, I feel like no one's really surprised, but I love this palette with my whole entire heart. And this is going to be one of those palettes that I feel like I'm going to be reaching for a lot, especially if I'm not filming. I feel like I'm going to be pulling for this palette, even just for the shimmers, but the mattes are also really, really, really nice. So let me know if there were any surprises in here. Let me know which of these palettes you thought I was going to maybe rank higher or lower. I would love to hear, because it's so interesting to see what you guys who have watched my videos think that I'm going to rank things as, because obviously like my experience actually using something is different than your experience watching me use something, if that makes sense. I don't know, I just find it very interesting, and it's so fun for me to do these too and just try to think about why I like or don't like something, because sometimes like I surprise myself with the rankings that I do, but this is just the way it ended up being this time, and I'm pretty happy with it. I think that if I'm gonna look back at this in a week from now, I still think that I'm going to be fairly happy with the way I rank these. So yeah, thank you so much for watching another one of my ranking videos. If you want to see more of these, I do have a ranking playlist, and if you're new, I would love it if you would consider subscribing, and hopefully I will see you all in my next video.